All right, so hello again. Oop. So before we start talking about the principles of traditional Chinese medicine, like what is qi, what is yin and yang, etc., we do need to make a pit stop and talk about the history of traditional Chinese medicine, because it's not as straightforward as people would tend to think. Here in the West, we tend to think of the term traditional Chinese medicine as being a catch-all phrase for all of the ancient practices and traditions from China. And that's not quite correct. It would be more accurate to say that traditional Chinese medicine, as practiced today, is like saying Nike, not like saying athletic shoe. And here's why. I'm going to refer to my notes so I don't miss anything. So in the 1950s, like I think 1950 itself, the Chinese Marxist government was taking over, and they realized that they had this truly enormous population and like zero infrastructure available to take care of that giant population. And so at that time, there was a big battle going on inside the brand new Marxist Chinese Department of Public Health, basically. And this battle was between the Chinese public health ministers and doctors who had been trained in Western medicine and felt that China at this turning point should adopt Western medicine, and the traditional public health ministers and doctors who had been trained in traditional Chinese medical practices and felt that they should keep those tried and true, standardized medical practices that their people and their practitioners were already familiar with. The decision was made to go with the traditional practices, but to codify them in a way that was more systemized and more just organized, so that they appeased those people who were looking for that more cut and dry scientific model that they had learned from the West. Now, what that then meant, because we're talking about a socialist government, right? Or communist government, pardon me. What that meant is that now the government had adopted this system, and so the government had to open these schools in order to teach this system. And these schools all had to have that standard government stamp curriculum. And that's where the real meat and potatoes of nitty-gritty, taking this information and putting it together into a codified curriculum, which was basically then named traditional Chinese medicine, came to be. And so China is huge. It's almost like it's a very large chunk of the continent, and Asia is a big continent. So you have regional practices. You have, maybe this region where their medicine is more about their 5-element system, and then you'll have that region where their medicine is more about the meridians, and this region where it's all about herbalism. And so what this new brand of traditional Chinese medicine did is it cherry-picked the hallmarks of the more widespread ancient traditions in order to codify them into this traditional Chinese medicine new model. Many modern acupuncturists and doctors of traditional Chinese medicine really don't seem to believe that this systemization caused the traditions to lose anything. And that's for two basic reasons. One is that it really was much more of a reorganization than a true cherry picking. And the other reason is that all of those original ancient documents and texts that the traditions were based on still exist today. They've been translated into more simple modern Chinese characters. They've been translated into other languages. And that information that the more ancient systems were based on before the systemization is still accessible. It would just be that, like, you had this famous doctor who wrote this text and that famous doctor who wrote that text, and he maybe put this information organized in this way, but he had it in a different way, and so you had to check like 15 different places to get a full picture of what the traditions had become. And so it was a reorganization and a systemization, but no knowledge that we know of was actually lost, that was still had by the time we got to the 1950s. The most important text to know about if you're talking about the history of traditional Chinese medicine is the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine. That work and many more are still available to practitioners today. It is by far the most famous of the ancient Chinese medical texts, and it is also one of the oldest human documents that we still have in existence. So we have evidence of the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine going back thousands and thousands of years BCE, and it's a fantastic piece of human history. All right, so in terms of the truly ancient roots of Chinese medicine, the key feature is for you guys to just remember it is super old. It is, like I said, one of the most ancient traditions that we still have access to from our tens of thousands of years of existence. And, you know, it might, I don't know if I wrote it down. I think it's about 7,000 years old that we know of, potentially older. Obviously, the roots of these traditions would be older. And what I want to also put in there is that this system, these ancient Chinese systems were a massive, massive step forward in the world, and one of the first places in human thinking where we started to move from a model of illness being caused by demons and being caused by superstitious things, performing exorcisms in order to cure illness and that type of a deal, and moved from that into your health being something you could affect. They were the first people who had a theory of contagion, right? So they did not have any microscopes. They didn't know what a germ was, but they knew that a cold wind could enter your body, right? So like a cold, like if you go out in the cold, your nose runs, you might cough, you might feel a chill. If you catch a cold, your nose runs, you might cough, you might catch a chill. So they thought that an angry wind was lodging in your body and that you could pass that angry wind upon your breath into the breath of another person. So they didn't have microscopes, but their observational skills were far ahead of Europe, far ahead of anywhere else that we have documentation of in terms of understanding contagion and also understanding that your basic lifestyle choices have an effect on your health, and observing all kinds of things. It is very much based in Taoism, and they were some observant people, man. They did pretty well for not having any microscopes or anything. So for your test, you know, all of these units are going to build towards your first quiz in Eastern healing. And the key features that I would like you to remember from the history of traditional Chinese medicine is that the roots are thousands of years old. The oldest text is that Yellow Emperor's Classic on Internal Medicine, one of the oldest texts we still have, super old. Yellow Emperor's Classic on Internal Medicine, and that the systemization and reorganization of traditional Chinese medicine happened in the early 1950s under the new communist government of China. So that is our little overview. Obviously, we're talking about thousands of years of history. There is a whole beautiful, rich, fascinating history of these practices in the context of their culture. But this is a 1-credit class, so we're keeping it light. So remember those 3 things, mark them down in your notes. I would recommend having like a document or maybe a notebook so that while you're watching these lectures that I'm giving you, you can make little notes to yourself as to the things that I tell you are more important to remember for the test. It is my goal to eventually have big old unit study guides and things, but that is a work in progress. So for now, just put those 3 things in your notes. Thousands of years old, Yellow Emperor's Classic on Internal Medicine, and the restructuring of traditional Chinese medicine happening in the early 1950s under the new Marxist communist government. So thank you so much. I will see you in the next video, and you have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye, guys.